I'm Jennifer, and you're listening to the Florida Gardener Podcast. There are many types of orchids, not just the colorful, showy ones you see at the grocery store. Florida boasts the most with over 100 native species. However, not all orchids like it warm and humid. Native orchids can be found in every state in the U.S. According to the North American Orchid Conservation Center, Alaska has over 30 species. For perspective, the Hawaiian Islands only have 3. So Alaska has 10 times more native orchids than the Hawaiian Islands. That's crazy. And yes, this also means there are warm-growing orchids and there are cool-growing orchids. The majority of the orchids found at the garden center or grocery store are Phalaenopsis orchids, often called phals for short, or moth orchids. Phals are warm-growing orchids. They are native to the tropical regions of Southeast Asia. Here, it stays consistently warm and sticky, with humidity ranging from 70 to 90%. Out of all the warm-growing orchids, the genus Phalaenopsis tend to be the least tolerant of cold. I feel we are led astray a bit when it comes to caring for moth orchids as houseplants. The inside of our home is generally dry and cool. Average humidity indoors is 30 to 50%. So of course phals would struggle inside. At the very least, flowering slows down, or despite your best efforts, it just doesn't ever bloom a second time. Proper lighting is also key. Moth orchids actually love light. It just shouldn't be direct afternoon sun. But a low-light room in your corner office isn't going to be enough for them either. Consider a grow light if your orchid is not receiving enough natural light. Now, sure, you can convert your sunroom into an orchid sanctuary, add a humidifier, or perhaps you have a terrarium. I get it. I'm not saying it can't be done. But for the average person, after 4 to 8 weeks on your coffee table or kitchen windowsill, your orchid will probably start to decline. When you see a gorgeous moth orchid display in a resort or lobby, it's important to understand that they have a professional that swaps out the orchids every 4 to 8 weeks. There isn't a magical way to keep them blooming and thriving in a harsh indoor environment for much longer than that. Trust me, I'm that person behind the scenes swapping them out. Once the show is over, my orchids go outside to rest and recover. Now let's just say for a moment I was able to keep a moth orchid happy and healthy in a cold, dark office year-round. In their natural environment, phals typically bloom once per year, usually in the cooler months. Sure, they can bloom more frequently than that, and there are ways to force it to bloom more often, but generally speaking, it's about once a year. So even if you have a happy, healthy moth orchid, for the majority of the year, it's going to look a bit underwhelming. I think this can be a bit misleading for folks. They see a nice arrangement at a resort or a restaurant, and they think they must be doing something wrong because theirs doesn't always look that way. It's not you, I promise. So why are we obsessed with moth orchids? They have an extended bloom time. In my experience, you can get up to 8 weeks of flowering inside. And outside, under the right conditions, they'll bloom for several months. And the flowers are large and dramatic. There's no arguing this. They are the most heavily hybridized orchid, meaning we as the consumer have tons of options when it comes to color and size. They are also easily accessible. This is the most widely sold orchid in the world. And sidebar, how long your orchid blooms depends on the care it receives, but also how far along it was in the bloom cycle when you purchased it. You ideally don't want all of the flowers open when you bring it home. In fact, an orchid grower near me sells these orchids at a discount. The ones that still have closed buds or buds that haven't fully opened are valued more. This is why when you Google how long do orchid flowers last, you'll see results ranging from 1 month to 6 months. It all depends on care and how far along the orchid was in flower production when you brought it home. And FYI, most nurseries and garden centers, especially retail facing, don't offer reduced pricing on orchids that are fully bloomed out. I think it's a unique situation with the one near me. So please don't hustle yours for a discount. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are many types of phals. The one we see at the store are only a small fragment of what is out there. Phalaenopsis is a genus of orchids with about 60 species, most of which are epiphytes. They have aerial roots and are also known as air plants. More on that later. Okay, so now what? The good news is you probably live in Florida if you're listening to this. So once your grocery store moth orchid starts to decline, simply move it outside so it can soak up the warmth and all the moisture in our air. Central and North Florida, keep your moth orchids outside as long as you can. If it gets real chilly, bring them inside. But as long as temps don't consistently dip below 50 degrees, they are okay. Now, if you're in South Florida, zones 10 and 11, generally, you should be able to keep them outside year-round. I am in zone 10A and I have a bunch of moth orchids attached to a tree. Now, we did have an interesting winter this year. So I started noticing new flower spikes in fall, and they were getting ready to flower when we had the cold snap at the end of January. The blooms fell prematurely because temps in the 20s and 30s are just too cold for these guys, especially because it was sustained. If it had just been one evening, they may have recovered. But we had at least 2 to 3 evenings of those lows back to back. Only time will tell, but I don't think I lost any. They just need time to bounce back. Now, these are general guidelines, but I wouldn't overthink it. I'm hard-pressed to believe one 49-degree evening is going to damage your plant. At home, I'm a pretty loose gardener, preferring to observe rather than control. Probably because I have to be so hands-on at work. But to me, it's more about understanding your tolerance or threshold for plant imperfections. Are you okay with a bit of damage, or is your goal to grow a perfect specimen of an orchid? And then also, how patient are you when things don't necessarily go the way that you planned? There's no right or wrong answer here. Now, this next part is important. Although you don't want extreme cold, phals do need cold exposure in order to bloom. In nature, lower temperatures trigger them to flower. So, if you're set on growing moth orchids indoors, bring your orchids outside for a few weeks when it's cooler to help initiate blooming. They only need a few weeks of cold exposure, and then you can bring them back inside. Nightly temps of 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit are the most desirable to initiate flower spikes. Okay, moving on. Whether you live in Tallahassee or the Keys, once it starts warming up, you want to have your moth orchids outside as often as you can. There is nothing like the great outdoors. The warmth and humidity are beneficial when it comes to their overall well-being. They are warm-growing orchids after all. It can't really get too hot for them. If you decide to keep your moth orchid potted, it's incredibly important to use an orchid bark mix. Remember, phals are epiphytes. Yes, similar to tillandsias. Orchid potting medium is usually a mix of pine bark, charcoal, and perlite. It's chunky, light, and airy. It doesn't retain a ton of water, which is ideal for these unique plants. Now, this part is important. When we purchase moth orchids at the grocery store, the roots are typically covered in sphagnum moss and jammed into a pot with poor airflow. Most issues arise when we leave our orchids just like this. You gotta take it out of that pot and remove the moss from the roots. Sometimes it's also grown in a brown, spongy medium. Remove all of it. Just pull as much of it away from the roots as possible so that you only have bare roots left, or as close to that as you can get it. You wanna see those babies dangling free. Don't worry about damaging the orchid roots. They are not as fragile as you think. Sphagnum moss, peat moss, coconut coir, they're all great at retaining moisture. This is why growers use them. A lot of time passes between when the orchids leave the grow house to the point at which they end up at your home. So essentially, this is the best way to keep the roots moist during transit. But long term, it's not ideal. These plants are not terrestrial. Their aerial roots do not want to be covered completely. And while they love water, they also love good airflow, and their roots want to dry out quickly. After all, in the wild, they cling to trees bare root. Also why traditional potting mix is not ideal. They need water, but they don't want to sit in a moist potting medium. So if you're keeping them potted, use an orchid mix in one of those ceramic or clay pots you've seen with a bunch of holes in it. Another great option is a hanging basket. They make wooden ones specifically designed for orchids. Folks will hang their orchids under trees with these hanging baskets, and it sort of mimics their natural conditions, receiving dappled light, natural rainfall, and frankly, bird droppings and all the other good stuff that feeds them. The baskets also make it easy to move your orchids, especially if cold weather is moving through. Fertilization. A water-soluble fertilizer specifically created for orchids is ideal. I don't feed the ones attached to my tree. They receive rainwater and all the other nutrients they need naturally. However, it doesn't hurt to give them an extra boost, especially if you want to max out flower power. Any that are on a covered patio or inside should be fed as well. Dilute the fertilizer more than the package recommends. You don't need as much as they claim. This goes for any liquid fertilizer. It's better to provide less than risk burning your plant. When it comes to watering, plant tags suggest ice cubes. This is because they don't want you to overwater the orchid and kill it. While ice cubes help prevent overwatering, the cold can shock their roots. It's not ideal long term. If your orchid is in an orchid pot and it's potted up with orchid mix, I wouldn't worry too much about overwatering. It'll be difficult to do this. Most issues arise when we leave orchids in the pots we bought them in with no holes for the roots to breathe, and the roots are so tightly wrapped in moss that they never have an opportunity to dry out. Now you have a few options when it comes to watering. You can water your orchid as you would any other plant. You can soak your orchid roots in a pot or bucket of water for a few minutes. You can spray the roots with water using a spray bottle. If you have it in a spot where it receives natural rainfall, you can let Mother Nature handle it. Or you can do a combination of all four methods. It doesn't really matter as long as they are getting a good drink and can dry out quickly. My neighbor is an orchid expert. He knows what he's doing and he takes it seriously. He waters all of his once a week, every Friday to be exact. His water spigot is at the front of his townhome and he has an adjoining unit on either side. So every Friday, he drags the hose through his townhome, literally inside, like through his living room, to the back of his home where his lanai is. And this is where he has like 20 or 30, I don't know how many to be exact, but just a ton of gorgeous, healthy orchids hanging. And he waters all of them. And approximately once a month, I would guess, at least in the warmer months, he takes them all down, fills a few buckets with water and fertilizer, and soaks them. I rarely water or fertilize mine. It's more of a let go and let God approach. Now, both my orchids and my neighbor's orchids bloom, but his are definitely prettier, certainly fit for a home and garden magazine, while mine look a bit more rough around the edges. So it just depends on how hands-on you want to be. Either way, you'll know your orchid needs water if the leaves are sad and droopy. They should be firm and slightly upright. Your orchid is probably receiving too much water if the leaves are yellowing and if the roots are mushy or discolored. If you do notice any mushy or discoloration on the roots, trim those roots off and let your orchid dry out before repotting. Let's talk about the flower spikes for a moment. After they are done flowering, you can cut the spike all the way back to the base, or if the spike is still green and healthy, you don't have to cut it all the way back. Instead, you can cut it back to a node instead of down to the base. If you cut the spike all the way back, it will encourage the orchid to rest a bit before growing an entirely new spike. Now, let's say you cut it back to a node instead of all the way down to the base. This will encourage the orchid to bloom again from the old spike. So what should you do? Option 1, cutting it all the way down allows the orchid time to rest and recover. It also requires more patience on your end because the orchid has to create an entirely new spike. But it rewards you with lots of nice, large, beautiful flowers. Option 2 is quicker because you already have a spike. but this means it's spending more energy on flower production instead of resting. In my experience, the flowers are not as prolific and they might be smaller. So it just depends on what you are trying to accomplish. FYI, while moth orchids can rebloom from the same spike, not all orchids do this. Speaking of other orchids, while this episode is primarily about the genus Phalaenopsis, don't forget there is a large variety of orchids outside this genus. I personally love Dendrobiums. This genus contains some of the most forgiving and hardy orchids in my experience. Great for beginners or the hands-off gardener, and they are easy enough to source. There are also many terrestrial orchids, aka ground orchids. Reed stem orchids are a type of terrestrial orchid that I enjoy growing. They are very forgiving and thrive in full sun. While they are primarily ground-dwelling, they can also adapt to grow on trees or rocks. Now, there are also many lesser-known orchids that grow in the Florida wild. Did you know that Florida has a native vanilla orchid, which grows like a vine, reaching 30 feet in length? The water spider orchid is one of the few truly aquatic orchids. They float along the surface of bodies of water throughout Florida. And the cranefly orchid is found in the hardwood forests of the Florida Panhandle. There are orchids for sun, orchids that are equipped to handle dry, sandy soil, and others that prefer boggy, swampy conditions. And you can find one native to almost every part of our state. The Florida butterfly orchid grows as an epiphyte in almost every county in the state. They can withstand a freeze, making them popular in northern parts of Florida. Now, word of caution, be mindful with sourcing. Some of our orchids, including the Florida butterfly, are commercially exploited. Do a bit of research before purchasing online. If possible, find a reputable nursery in your area, reach out to an orchid club in your community, or even check out a local plant swap. But just be mindful, as we certainly don't want to support plant poaching, at least if we can help it. Now, if you're really hung up on keeping moth orchids inside as houseplants, to the best of your ability, try to mimic the outdoor conditions we have discussed today. I also encourage you to explore some of the many other orchids that grow on planet Earth. There are about 25,000 species of orchids in the world. My first thought is, what about a temperate orchid that is more comfortable in the cooler indoor air? I'm not an orchid expert. There are just too many. I take care of them for clients, but as soon as they are done flowering, I remove them from the office or restaurant, and I bring them back home and keep them outside to recover. And then I just go and buy brand new ones to replace the ones that are recovering. I'm fortunate because I have close to ideal conditions where I live in Zone 10A, so I don't really have to do a ton to them outside. With that being said, if I were growing orchids inside, I wouldn't go all in on moth orchids. I'm not saying you can't grow them inside, but I would diversify and try a few different types. I have not personally grown the following inside, but a few you may want to consider are Dendrobiums. Like I mentioned earlier, I have grown them outside and they've proven to be the most forgiving for me. And according to UF IFAS, a great choice for the indoors is the jewel orchid. This pretty lady is unique because she's actually known more for her attractive foliage rather than her flowers. If it were me, I would do a deep dive on warm-growing orchids that have a high cold tolerance. My thought being they may be more adaptable to a variety of different indoor living conditions. And even orchids that are native to dry, arid regions. Succulents are generally easy to grow inside, right? Well, what about desert orchids? I don't know anything about them, but I do know it's a thing. All right, so that was information overload, but I hope this episode helps you on your journey with moth orchids and beyond. After all, moth orchids are wonderful, but we're really just scratching the surface. There is so much to explore and understand when it comes to this huge and diverse family of plants. And that's what makes it so interesting. All right, everyone. I'll be back soon for episode 32. In the meantime, if you'd like to subscribe to my free newsletter, shop my garden, or check out my social, you can access everything by visiting my website, rootsredefined.com. That's roots, ROOTS, redefined, REDEFINED.com. FINED.com. All right, guys, we'll see you again soon.